I want to review a few segments from one of Adam Curtis's old documentaries from a series titled The Living Dead. And in many ways, this series tackles, I would say, the post-war Geist in many different aspects. The aftermath of World War II, the kind of centralization of the United States as the new kind of post-European world leader, and the kind of globalized system of consumerism, technological enthusiasm, and kind of utopianism around, things like, world peace and so forth, which Adam Curtis is quite fond of and quite good at poking holes in. In one segment of this series, Curtis tackles the cognitive sciences and the behavioral sciences and the kind of psychiatric research, which didn't start after World War II, started before that, but it kind of manifested itself on a larger scale after World War II. Western society sort of began to believe that the brain, the mind, was similar to a computer. This is something in cognitive sciences, which is a commonly held belief. That ranges, of course, from the human mind is sort of in some ways like a computer to no, the human mind is literally just like a computer. So there's a spectrum of association of the human mind to a computer there. So cognitive science doesn't simply operate under one rigid theory, that there's a spectrum of association. So we should keep that in mind. But nonetheless, in this documentary, Curtis starts to investigate some of the history and some of the ideas around around this association in general, which human beings had never really made before the 20th century, and that human beings had never made on a large scale before the second half of the 20th century. There are a few consequences, I should say, for this association of a mind to a computer. What is of particular note for Curtis in this documentary, which I'm going to pick up on and try to expand the range of those concerns and point out some secondary, tertiary observations we can think about with those concerns, is the question of human memory. So within cognitive behavioral sciences, the more we associate the human mind with a computer, the more human memory becomes something that we can manipulate and something that we can control. This is of particular importance, obviously, for a number of reasons. Philosophy of mind, the ethics of psychology, the ethics of psychological practice, what are psychologists and psychiatrists really doing, social engineering, all of these different themes are of the utmost importance in regards to this topic. But I want to particularly hone in on the theme of the end of history. Because although the end of history, we understand the end of history as something which Fukuyama declared in 1989 with the fall of the Berlin Wall, the zeitgeist of the end of history goes back further than that. And this documentary, I think, shows that. And one of the understandings which has created the end of history, which is more than just simply the geopolitical state of our world, is the question of human nature and human spirit and human memory in context to history. Because if the human mind is simply like a computer, and memory then can be completely installed or taken out, like you can do with the computer, then human historical subjectivity and historical self-awareness suddenly alters in a significant sense. Ultimately, what you see with cognitive sciences and the theme of human memory is the attempt, I think, to socially engineer and condition and alter human existence into something which is not an expression of historical memory. In these segments, which I'm going to play, we see what we could call a sort of organized attack on human memory from a political perspective. An organized attack on human memory as something which is something which is human memory, that being something which we need to civilize ourselves out of, because human memory is bad, gets us into trouble, gets us into conflicts and so forth. So I'm going to play this first little segment, which gives us, I suppose, a kind of introduction into the goals and the historical frame of these experiments with memory and with the manipulation of memory. They stem from two particular figures who were Canadian psychiatrists and I suppose kind of neurosurgeons who believed that human memory was simply a set of, I suppose, electrical impulses or something which we could reduce to something material and therefore something manipulable. And as you'll see from this clip, one of these leading figures, one of these leading neuroscientists and psychiatrists, his name is Eamon Cameron. He was also involved, for some reason, I'm not sure in what capacity, with the Nuremberg trials after World War II. So his idea, as we'll see, was that memory leads to things like nationalism, which leads to things like conflict and war. And if we could manipulate memory, therefore, we could create a kind of perfectly rational and peaceful world society.
Penfield was convinced he had discovered how memories were stored in the brain. They were patterns in the neurons, like electrical circuits. By touching the right point, he could play back what he called time's strip of film. Towards the end of the war, Penfield invited a psychiatrist called Ewan Cameron to come and join him in Montreal. Cameron was fascinated by Penfield's work. He believed that if it was possible to change memories, one could produce better, more rational human beings.
Cameron was, in a way, a dreamer. He was a great pragmatist, but he was also a great dreamer. He thought that psychiatry should not just concentrate on sick people, mentally ill, but should actually go into government, that politicians should listen to psychiatrists. Psychiatrists should be in every parliament and should direct and monitor political activities because they knew in a rational, scientific way what was good for people.
Cameron had been an advisor to the judges at the Nuremberg trials. The experience convinced him that the bitter rivalries of nationalism, which had led to the war, had to be eradicated. Nationalism, he thought, existed only in people's minds as distorted historical memories. If those memories could somehow be altered, one could produce a rational world, free of war.
What Cameron thought was that mankind was not inherently evil. When he came back from Nuremberg trial, where he was an expert, he could see that what had happened with prejudice and nationalism leading to World War I and II, he thought that should never happen again. And he hoped that nationalism could be wiped out. People would forget about it. They would remake people.
Therapeutic techniques which were cultivated in this time may seem to us to be, irrelevant. These are things which wouldn't happen today. These are things which were experimented with and are no longer used, such as electroshock therapy. the sort of vulgar manipulation, the vulgar attempt to completely manipulate the mind like this is to us today offensive and not something which we, at least in kind of the liberal West, practice, even if we do sort of see the mind as being somewhat similar or entirely similar to a computer. These sorts of practices, which we kind of associate with like horror films or something, right? Like opening up your brain in order to poke around it and manipulate you, to erase your memory, manipulate your memory, install good memories. These things seem to us today to be entirely ethically and politically problematic, and rightly so. However, this original understanding that, or original assumption, this original association which was created in this time between the human mind and a computer, and the idea that a perfect world, a better world, could be actualized through the manipulation and control of human memory, isn't something that went away, even if the more vulgar therapeutic and psychiatric practices, which you can see if you watch this documentary, have to a large extent gone away. Much of the middle section, we could say, of this documentary covers the association which intelligence agencies such as the CIA, or the interest that these intelligence agencies had with these sorts of psychiatric experiments. For example, the possibility of completely controlling someone's brain, completely controlling someone's mind, completely controlling someone's behavior in order to create, for example, a sleeper agent, an assassin, and so on and so forth. These direct forms of cognitive and behavioral manipulation, the possibility to conduct these sorts of manipulations to such a great extent obviously have potential uses for the secret services and for sabotage, intelligence operations, and certain forms of military operations, which may be conducted between different groups for different interests who have different power structures and so on and so forth. As Curtis acknowledges in this documentary, these attempts at psychiatric and neuroscientific control of human thought and behavior have largely, I think, they're likely still investigated and practiced to some extent, but something else overtook them. Something else became the manifestation and the expression of this association with a human brain and a computer. And as Curtis will describe in his next section, which I'm going to show a clip of, that next stage of the association with the human mind and a computer came through, well, computers. It came through the literal invention of computers themselves.
The CIA stopped all funding of psychological research, and Dr. Cameron turned to study the memory of a simpler organism, the flatworm. But the dream of creating a controllable mind that could be programmed was far from over. It was about to take a strange new twist. Cognitive science came up with a new idea. If it was impossible to make the human mind behave like a machine, the alternative was to make a machine with a mind of its own. Scientists now began to build intelligent machines with memories that could be programmed. They taught them to recognize and to understand the world around them. The scientists were inspired by the same underlying belief that had driven the experiments of the 1950s, that the mind and the computer were identical. But they were going to push this idea much further.
A lot of people thought that the mind was in some respects like a computer. But there were others, they insisted something much more radical, which was that the mind is a computer. And the only good psychological theory is a computer program, because basically there's just a computer in the head. It was a heady idea for them. They had the notion that very soon, using these new computer techniques and ideas, they would be able to simulate the processes on the computer. And when people are that confident, they are good salesmen for their ideas, and a lot of people bought it.
At this very same moment, the Cold War also changed direction. It was no longer fought out by human agents. It became instead a war of machines. Both sides now possessed enough nuclear missiles for what was called mutual assured destruction, or MAD. The fear was that the slightest mistake could lead to all-out war. To those in charge of America's defense, the idea of intelligent machines was extremely attractive. Their memories would be completely controllable. Unlike human beings, they would not make mistakes.
Artificial intelligence emerged at the point at which there was the immediate worry of a war, some kind of a rationally breaking out war, and that maybe this was some way of helping to control the situation. So there was a lot of magic thinking, I think, that was set loose by the concept of artificial intelligence, that we would have a wonderful kind of control, a big brother control kind of thing. And it was always a tempting one. It wasn't quite a mean Orwellian one. It was like the people in Orwell, they thought it would be great. Things would be looked after.
Within this history of cognitive psychology, psychiatry, neuroscience, applied therapeutically, medically, of course, as a response, as we saw earlier, to the idea that you could make people more rational through controlling their memory, or that if human memory could be more manipulable, people would become more rational and they would become more peaceful. Quite ironically, over time, the intelligence services and the military-industrial complex picks up on these ideas, which are built around the association of a mind with a machine, of something which has a memory which is rationally controllable, to create these perfect military weapons, which are computers in the sense that their mind is something which is entirely manipulable. This is a theme which we need to incorporate the work of Paul Virilio, the French philosopher of speed, in order to properly understand. The overcomplexity and the technological advancement of military weapons created a system of defense whereby machines and systems of weapon systems and counter missile defense weapon systems, a kind of extremely fast, globally expansive system of weapons defense and weapons projections, overtook the traditional military man, the traditional general, the traditional soldier. To quote Virilio, he says, "The transition from the state of siege of wars of space to the state of emergency of the war of time only took several decades, during which the political era of the statesman was replaced by the apolitical era of the state apparatus." So this quote by Virilio is intended to observe the consequences, the political consequences of advanced weapons technologies which could fire missiles around the world very, very quickly. In such a system of very, very rapid and very, very fast and very, very destructive weapons, missile systems, the time that it takes for a military general to make a decision, to evaluate the decision, to think about the decision in all of its totality, its political, ethical, practical, tactical totality, is completely overridden by the necessity to have a system which replaces a mind, which can respond to the threat of nuclear attack instantly. This of course creates the necessity for machines that can quote unquote think at a greater and greater speed than the human mind can. The human mind is, of course, in comparison, slow, but it's not just slow. The human mind is burdened with, as I said before, a totality of concerns: political, ethical, practical, tactical, and so forth.
During the 1970s, a completely new type of weapon was developed in America: intelligent missiles with memories that could be programmed. The most famous was the cruise missile, which had a picture of its target stored in its memory. These weapons were a direct product of the science of artificial intelligence. They fundamentally altered the balance of power in the Cold War. In return, artificial intelligence became a powerful science. The idea that human beings and computers were identical came to dominate not just scientific thinking, but popular culture too.
I'd like to grab inside your head for a minute and haul it over here and down here for a minute, where I've got some friends gathered at something called
the era of nuclear deterrence and the era of weapon systems that can fire a nuclear weapon, or halfway around the world within like a few minutes, is an era which is kind of intrinsically apolitical, because it's an era of machines making decisions over war and peace rather than human beings making decisions over war and peace. But nonetheless, I want to pick up on this specific component of memory, which Curtis reveals to us in this documentary. The desire to create a weapons system, a military tool, something which determines issues of war and peace, something which is the agent of a violent act, something which is there to defend us from the threat of violent acts, as a machine, as something which has perfectly manipulable memory, is important in many different aspects. The history of conflict management and the psychology of human violence and human aggression is very, very related to memory. Historical memory, of course, is in a sense a precondition for cycles of revenge. If you can't remember the injustice that was bestowed upon you or your community or your family or anything like that, then how can you look for revenge? History, properly speaking, is merely the expression of physical conflict over historical accounts of injustice, which are collected over time. A people can never pursue some sort of independence, some sort of sovereignty, some sort of justice without their historical memory. Without the historical memory of the Greeks being subjugated by the Persians, they could have never defended themselves against the Persians. Without the historical memory of the Germanic tribes being subjugated by the Romans, they could have never massacred all those Roman legions in the Teutoburg forest, just to give you two examples. So the irony here is that we move from a notion that if you can control human memory, you can create a world of pure peace and rationality, and then all of a sudden we're creating weapon systems which are replacing the soldier with a machine which has a completely manipulable memory. So the illusion of peace and rationality has sort of been surpassed. We acknowledge that we need to violently control people. We are going to enforce world peace violently. We're going to use weapons technologies to ensure a certain level of security and prosperity and so on and so forth. This is the American role within the post-world order, the militant, technologically advanced militant insurer of global trade and security. So we move from the idea that if you can control human memory, you can create, peace and order, to the idea that if you can control human memory, you can stop retaliation. This is the Nietzschean undercurrent to these, or not the Nietzschean undercurrent. This is a Nietzschean perspective which we could use to criticize the notion of controlling memory in order to create peace and rationality. That what is being sold to you as a new era of peace and rationality is simply the desire for the technologically advanced civilizations to be able to express violent domination on other nations without having to deal with the tricky and unfortunate capacity for human memory to remember those injuries, to remember those injustices, to remember those harms, and seek revenge. In fact, the US's entire modus operandi has been more or less to use advanced weapon technologies to enforce a global order of peace and security and prosperity, whilst at the same time trying to re-educate the world out of their historical memory, whether that be the historical memory of the Europeans, whether that be the historical memory of Muslims, of people in the Middle East, and so forth. It's evident that people's sense of dignity, their sense of sovereignty, their sense of justice is contingent on their identity, their historical identity, and their historical memory to a large extent. If you can sort of remove that historical memory and that historical identity from the battlefield, there's a kind of rationalist illusion here, a technologically fetishistic and rationalist illusion that we can have kind of violent management of global orders which don't end up themselves creating the conditions for the injuries and accounts which seek people to demand sovereignty, freedom, justice, and often revenge. Human memory, again, to make a Nietzschean point, is in a sense dangerous. It does hold on to injuries, it does hold on to injustices, and it does not simply let these go, but demand an account, demand a retaliation, demand a response. And if we can get rid of that sense of memory and that sense of historical identity, the post-historical illusion is that we can have perfect peace and order and security. Since the end of World War II, the kind of post-war establishment which is being created is very much built off of the assumption that you can civilize people by destroying their historical memory, that you can civilize people by kind of creating a state of amnesia or dementia where nothing is remembered. The way in which historical accounts of injustice and injury from one individual to another or from one group to another would have been dealt with before would have been through two ways. One would be warfare, traditional warfare. The other would be forms of political negotiation. So the Clausewitzian model of war being simply an expression of politics by other means. Politics could also be an expression of war by other means, to the extent that it's designed in order to settle scores and in order to negotiate around built-up tensions caused by disagreements and injuries from one person to another, from one group to another. These two traditional, we could say, modes of dealing with the phenomena of injury and injustice have been replaced with sort of technologically advanced form of civilized dementia. I'll leave this little rant with a clip of a lady who was interviewed in this documentary, who underwent memory reprogramming therapy, and her account of what happened to her is actually worrying, because it's not a simple account of, oh my God, I was abused, I was forced to do it, these authoritarian people destroyed my wonderful memories. Her account of what happened to her is actually more worrying, because in a sense she approves of it. In a sense, she describes in this scene, which I'm going to play in a second, that there is a certain kind of perverted appeal in total memory loss.
What had been done to me was wrong and horrible, but I was freed up because I didn't have any memory. I didn't have to worry about a memory. I was exactly who I had shaped myself into being, and people kept wanting to feel sorry for me and that I was a victim. I understand that because they were horrible experiments, but on a personal, individual basis, I was not a victim, because I was freed up from any of the garbage that people who have memory carry around with them all the time. Memory is a dangerous thing.